The escape. The jungle was alive with sound, a cacophony of alien creatures crying out in the dark. Zarek ran, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. His breathing was ragged, each gulp of air burning in his lungs. The heavy chains that once shackled his wrists now hung loose, clinking softly as he moved. For years, he had been a slave, forced to obey the commands of an alien overlord. Now he was free, or so he thought. A branch snapped behind him. Zarek froze, his pointed ears twitching. He crouched low, his gray, scaled skin blending into the shadows. The Overlord's hunters were relentless, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they had his head. He clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palms. Fear coursed through him, but so did a spark of determination. He wouldn't go back. Not this time. The betrayal still stung. He had been loyal to his overlord, believing the lies about honor and survival. But when the enemy attacked, the overlord had shown his true colors. Zarek was expendable, a pawn to be sacrificed. The last thing he heard before being left behind was the overlord's mocking laughter, echoing in his mind like a cruel melody. The jungle floor was uneven, covered in twisted roots and sharp rocks. Zarek moved carefully, avoiding the glowing plants that could reveal his location. He needed to find shelter, a place to hide until the hunters gave up. But deep down, he knew they wouldn't. Not until he was captured or dead. Suddenly, a thunderous crash shattered the silence. The ground trembled beneath Zarek's feet as a bright light lit up the sky. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. Something was falling, streaking across the heavens like a fiery comet. It disappeared behind a line of jagged cliffs, followed by the deafening sound of impact. Curiosity tugged at Zarek. Whatever had crashed wasn't from this planet. He hesitated, glancing back the way he had come. The hunters would still be tracking him, but the crash could be an opportunity or a trap. His instincts told him to keep running, but his curiosity was stronger. Gritting his teeth, he turned toward the cliffs. The climb was steep and treacherous. Zarek's claws scraped against the rocks as he pulled himself up, muscles straining with the effort. The closer he got to the top, the stronger the smell of burnt metal and fuel became. When he finally reached the summit, he crouched low, scanning the area. The crash site was a mess of twisted metal and debris. Smoke billowed into the air, and flames licked at the edges of the wreckage. Zarek's sharp eyes caught movement near the center of the wreck. A figure stumbled out, silhouetted by the fire. It was a human, a woman. She was injured, clutching her side as she limped forward. Zarek's breath caught. He had heard stories about humans, whispered among the slaves. They were unpredictable, dangerous, and fiercely protective of their own. He didn't trust her, but something about the way she moved, struggling to stay upright despite the pain, stirred a strange sense of sympathy within him. The woman collapsed to her knees, coughing. Zarek hesitated, torn between helping her and staying hidden. She was clearly vulnerable, but if she was part of some rescue mission, others might be nearby. He needed answers, and she was his only lead. Carefully, Zarek approached, his footsteps silent on the rocky ground. The woman didn't notice him until he was only a few feet away. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear and surprise. She reached for a weapon at her side, but her hand trembled, and she dropped it. "Stay back," she warned, her voice hoarse. "I'll fight if I have to." Zarek raised his hands, showing he wasn't armed. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice low and calm. His grasp of the human language was limited, but he hoped it was enough. The woman's gaze narrowed. "Who are you?" "Zarek," he said simply. He pointed to the wreckage. "Your ship, it's destroyed." She laughed bitterly, a sound full of frustration. "Yeah, no kidding." Zarek glanced over his shoulder, his ears twitching. The hunters wouldn't be far behind. "We need to move," he said urgently. "It's not safe here." The woman frowned but didn't argue. She tried to stand, wincing as pain shot through her body. Zarek stepped forward and offered his arm. She hesitated, then took it, leaning on him for support. Her trust, though reluctant, felt strange to Zarek. He wasn't used to anyone relying on him or treating him as an equal. As they made their way down the cliffs, Zarek kept his senses sharp. The jungle loomed ahead, dark and full of dangers. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know who this human was or why she had come to this planet, but one thing was certain: their fates were now intertwined. And together, they might just have a chance to survive. Unlikely allies. Maria woke to the sound of soft humming. It wasn't the hum of her ship's engines. Those were long gone. But something else. It was low, rhythmic, almost melodic, and it seemed to echo from every direction in the dense jungle. Her head pounded, her body ached, and every breath was a struggle. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her side. Her hand instinctively went to the bandage there, improvised strips of fabric tied tightly around her ribs. She blinked, trying to focus. The bandage wasn't hers. Her eyes snapped open. She wasn't alone. Across the small clearing, sitting cross-legged and sharpening a jagged blade of metal, was the alien. His gray, scaled skin shimmered faintly in the dim light of the jungle, and his large, sharp eyes were focused on the weapon in his hands. Maria's first instinct was to reach for her sidearm, but it wasn't there. She cursed under her breath, the sound drawing his attention. The alien's gaze flicked to her, and he tilted his head. For a moment, they just stared at each other, neither making a move. "You fixed me up?" she asked cautiously, her voice hoarse. He nodded once. "You were bleeding. Could not leave you." Maria frowned. "Why not? You don't even know me." The alien's eyes narrowed, as if he didn't fully understand her words, but his tone was calm when he replied. "You are not enemy. You are like me. Like you." Maria couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped her. "I'm nothing like you." The alien said nothing, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of pain, or perhaps regret, that made Maria pause. He stood slowly, the blade still in his hand, and motioned toward her. "Hunters come. We must move." Maria's heart sank. "Hunters. Overlord soldiers," the alien said grimly. "They hunt me. Now they hunt you too." Maria didn't like the sound of that. She forced herself to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain that flared up in her side. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "Zarek," he said simply. "All right, Zarek," Maria said, straightening despite her injuries. "If they're coming for me too, then I guess we're stuck together for now. But let's get one thing clear. I don't trust you." Zarek's lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile. "Good," he said. "I do not trust you either." Building suspense and setting their journey. The air was heavy as they set off through the jungle. Zarek moved with the silent grace of a predator, his keen eyes scanning the terrain ahead. Maria followed behind, her boots crunching softly on the forest floor. "You know this planet well?" Maria asked after a while. Zarek nodded. "Lived here, served the Overlord, learned to survive." "Served him?" Maria's voice was incredulous. "Why would you work for someone who wants you dead?" Zarek stopped abruptly, his gaze hardening. "Not work. Slavery." Maria felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't meant to pry, but his words cut deeper than she expected. The conversation ended as a distant, mechanical screech tore through the jungle. Zarek's head snapped toward the sound, his nostrils flaring. "Drone," he muttered. "It searches for us." Maria's stomach tightened. "Can you disable it?" Zarek didn't answer. He crouched low, gesturing for Maria to follow his lead. They moved quickly but carefully, weaving through the underbrush. The sound of the drone grew louder, its high-pitched whine like nails on metal. They reached a clearing just as the drone appeared, a sleek, black machine hovering above the treetops, its bright red scanner sweeping the area. Zarek grabbed Maria's arm, pulling her into the shadows. "Stay here," he whispered. "What are you?" Maria started, but he was already gone, slipping into the clearing with a speed that took her breath away. The drone spun toward him, its scanner locking on. A sharp hiss erupted from its core, and a beam of light shot out, barely missing Zarek as he dodged to the side. Maria's heart raced as she watched Zarek move. He was fast, almost too fast to follow, darting around the clearing with fluid, practiced motions. He lured the drone closer, then leaped onto a low branch and swung himself upward. The drone hesitated, its scanner searching for him. That was its mistake. Zarek dropped down from above, driving his blade into the machine's core. Sparks flew as the drone sputtered and fell to the ground, lifeless. Maria stepped out from the shadows, staring at the wreckage. "You're pretty handy with that thing," she said, nodding toward the blade. Zarek wiped the blade clean on his arm. "Learned from survival," he said simply. She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, Zarek. Maybe I don't trust you, but I think I might need you." Zarek glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We need each other," he said. And with that, the unlikely pair vanished back into the jungle, the first flickers of a fragile alliance forming between them. Hunted. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the scent of decaying vegetation and something metallic. Blood, maybe. Zarek froze mid-step, raising a clawed hand to signal Maria to stop. She didn't question him this time. The tension in his body told her everything she needed to know. Something was close. She crouched low, gripping the salvaged piece of piping Zarek had fashioned into a weapon for her. It wasn't much, but in her hands, it felt like a lifeline. A distant rustling sound echoed through the jungle, faint but growing closer. "Predators," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Zarek's sharp eyes scanned the dense foliage ahead. "Not predators," he murmured. "Hunters." Maria's stomach dropped. She had only glimpsed the Overlord's soldiers once, during the crash landing. Their sleek, insect-like armor and silent, coordinated movements were etched into her memory. These weren't mindless beasts. They were trackers, killers, and they never missed their prey. "How far?" she asked, gripping the pipe tighter. Zarek tilted his head, listening. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed even more threatening. "Too close," he said. "Move." They slipped into the shadows, weaving between massive roots and glowing fungi. Zarek led the way, his movements fluid and silent, while Maria did her best to mimic him. Every sound she made, a snapped twig, a scuffed boot, felt like a beacon to their pursuers. Her breath quickened. "Where are we even going?" "There is a cave," Zarek replied, his voice calm but urgent. "Hidden. Safe, if we reach it." If. That word hung in the air, as heavy as the jungle mist. The first encounter. They hadn't gone far when Zarek suddenly stopped again, his ears twitching. Maria opened her mouth to ask what was wrong, but before she could, he yanked her down behind a thick tree trunk. A low hum filled the air, a sound Maria recognized all too well. Drones. Zarek peered around the trunk, his sharp gaze locking onto a pair of hovering machines gliding through the trees. Their scanners emitted faint red beams, sweeping back and forth across the jungle floor. Maria felt her chest tighten. She whispered, "Can you take them out?" Zarek shook his head. "No time. Too many. Must wait." They crouched there, silent and still, as the drones passed by, their beams narrowly missing the pair. Maria held her breath, every second stretching into an eternity. When the drones disappeared into the distance, Zarek exhaled softly. "Go. Now." They moved quickly, the urgency in Zarek's steps propelling them forward. But just as Maria began to think they might make it to safety, a sharp, guttural cry rang out behind them. Maria's blood ran cold. What was that? Zarek didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed her arm and pulled her into a sprint. The cry was followed by another, closer this time. The sound was unmistakable. The hunters had found their trail. The chase, Maria's lungs burned as she ran, her injured side screaming in protest. Zarek led the way, his pace relentless, as if the pain and exhaustion didn't touch him. The cries of the hunters grew louder, joined by the unmistakable hiss of energy weapons charging up. A bolt of green light shot past them, striking a nearby tree. The impact sent shards of bark flying, and the tree toppled with a deafening crash. "Faster!" Zarek shouted, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. Maria pushed herself harder, but the hunters were gaining. She could hear their heavy footfalls now, their insectoid armor clinking as they closed in. Zarek suddenly veered left, pulling Maria into a narrow ravine. The walls rose steeply on either side, offering some cover but trapping them in a dead end if the hunters found them. "This is your plan," Maria hissed. Zarek didn't respond. He was already scanning the ravine, his sharp eyes searching for something. Finally, he pointed to a jagged overhang of rock above them. "Climb." Maria stared at him like he was insane. "I can't." "Climb," he snapped, his voice harsh but not unkind. Swallowing her fear, Maria began to climb. Her hands slipped on the wet rock, and her injured side protested with every movement, but she kept going. Zarek was right behind her, his claws finding purchase easily. Below them, the hunters entered the ravine. The trap. As Maria scrambled onto the overhang, Zarek stayed below, crouching low and watching the hunters. There were 3 of them, their insect-like helmets scanning the area. "What are you doing?" Maria whispered frantically. "Get up here." Zarek didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a large rock and hurled it down the ravine. The sound echoed, drawing the hunters' attention. They moved toward the noise, their weapons raised. Zarek waited until they were directly beneath the overhang. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he leaped down. Maria watched in stunned silence as Zarek landed on one of the hunters, his blade flashing. The soldier went down with a garbled cry, its armor sparking as Zarek struck again. The other 2 turned, but Zarek was already moving, darting between them with a predator's grace. Maria clenched the pipe in her hands, her heart pounding. She wanted to help, but Zarek didn't seem to need it. Within moments, all 3 hunters lay motionless on the ground. Zarek looked up at her, his breathing heavy. "Now," he said, his voice steady once more. "We move." Maria nodded, climbing down carefully. She didn't trust Zarek, not entirely, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. Together, they disappeared into the jungle, the cries of more hunters echoing behind them. The Overlord's trap. The message came like a ghost in the wind, a low, crackling voice that seemed to crawl out of the jungle itself. Maria froze mid-step, her heart skipping a beat. The words were distorted, warped by static, but she recognized the cold, commanding tone immediately. "Zarek," the voice drawled, sharp and cruel. "You cannot hide from me. Surrender now, and your suffering will end quickly." Maria turned to Zarek, whose face was etched with tension. His jaw tightened, his claws flexing at his sides. He didn't respond to the message, but she could see the weight of it pressing down on him. "That's him, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low. He nodded once. "The Overlord. He knows we are here." Before Maria could respond, the voice returned, louder this time, as if the jungle itself was amplifying its reach. "And the human." The Overlord continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "How fascinating. I expected you to leave her behind, Zarek. Such sentiment is unlike you." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The Overlord wasn't guessing. He knew exactly where they were, and he was toying with them. "We need to move," Maria said, gripping her makeshift weapon tighter. "Now." Zarek shook his head, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "No. He wants us to run. That is the trap." The broadcast of fear. The jungle grew unnaturally quiet, as if the creatures within it were holding their breath. Then, all at once, dozens of small drones emerged from the shadows, their red scanners sweeping the trees. Each carried a speaker, amplifying the Overlord's taunts. "You are surrounded, Zurich. You cannot escape, but perhaps I will make you a deal. Give me the human, and I will spare you." Maria glared at Zurich. "He's lying," she snapped. "I know," Zurich replied evenly. Despite his calm exterior, Maria could see the faint tremor in his hands. This wasn't just a hunt, it was psychological warfare. The Overlord wasn't just after Zurich's body. He wanted his mind to break first. The drones began to converge, their movements coordinated, herding them toward a narrow ravine. Maria's pulse quickened. "We can't let them trap us," she said. Zurich's eyes narrowed as he calculated their options. "No," he said. "We use their trap against them." The trap within a trap. Maria didn't like the sound of that, but she trusted Zurich's instincts. They followed the drone's herding pattern, allowing themselves to be funneled toward the ravine. The terrain grew rougher, the air thick with tension. As they approached the ravine's edge, Maria spotted movement in the distance. Figures in sleek, black armor, Overlord soldiers, were waiting for them. Her stomach clenched. "Great plan, Zurich," she muttered. "Not yet," he replied, his voice steady. Zurich led her to a cluster of rocks just before the ravine. He crouched low, motioning for her to do the same. "Listen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ravine is unstable. Rocks. Loose. If we can trigger a collapse, it will take them out." Maria glanced at the soldiers advancing toward them. "And us." Zurich gave her a faint smile. "We climb fast." She wasn't convinced, but there was no time to argue. The drones closed in behind them, and the soldiers were drawing their weapons. The ravine showdown. The first shot came from one of the soldiers, a bolt of green energy that struck a nearby boulder and sent shards of rock flying. Maria ducked, adrenaline surging through her veins. Zurich leaped into action, scaling the rocks with terrifying speed. Maria followed, her hands slipping on the damp surface as she climbed higher. The soldiers advanced, their weapons firing in controlled bursts. Zurich reached a large, precariously balanced boulder and began hacking at its base with his blade. "Hurry," Maria shouted, her voice drowned out by the sound of gunfire. Zurich didn't respond. With one final strike, the boulder shifted, teetering on the edge before plunging into the ravine. The ground shook as it struck, triggering a chain reaction. Rocks and debris cascaded down, swallowing the soldiers below. The drones hovered uncertainly, their scanners flickering. Maria clung to the rocks, her heart pounding as the ground beneath her threatened to give way. "Zurich," she shouted. He appeared beside her, grabbing her arm and pulling her up just as the ledge collapsed. They scrambled to safety, collapsing onto solid ground as the dust settled. A hollow victory. Maria coughed, her lungs burning from the dust. "Please tell me that was the worst of it," she said between breaths. Zurich didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the ravine, his expression grim. "What is it?" Maria asked, following his gaze. From the shadows of the ravine, a single figure emerged. It was taller than the soldiers, its armor more elaborate, its presence radiating authority. Maria's heart sank. "Is that?" Zurich nodded slowly. "The Overlord." The Overlord raised a hand, and the remaining drones aligned themselves behind him like a swarm of locusts. His voice echoed through the jungle once more, colder and more menacing than before. "You disappoint me, Zurich," he said. "But no matter. You cannot win." Maria gripped her weapon tightly, her eyes meeting Zurich's. "What now?" she asked. Zurich's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Maria saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "We fight," he said. And with that, the jungle erupted into chaos once more. The turning point. The silence was worse than the noise. Maria crouched behind a shattered console in the abandoned alien facility, gripping her makeshift weapon so tightly her knuckles turned white. The air was thick with the metallic tang of burnt circuits, and the only sound was the faint hum of dormant machinery. Zarek stood a few feet away, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. His body was tense, coiled like a predator ready to pounce. Maria had never seen him this on edge before, and that terrified her more than the hunters they had just evaded. "Why did they stop chasing us?" Maria whispered. Zarek didn't look at her. "Because they don't need to. They've already won." Maria frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering, Zarek reached out and pressed his hand against a cracked console. The screen flickered to life, its alien script glowing faintly. He scanned the symbols, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Maria asked, stepping closer. Zarek's voice was low, almost a growl. "A trap. This facility, it was meant to lure survivors, to give them hope." And then, a sudden sharp crack echoed through the room. Maria whipped around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the shadows, pressing in like a living thing. Zarek's claws flexed, and then it kills them. A glimmer of hope. Maria's heart sank. She had hoped the facility would offer them a fighting chance, some sort of weapon, or at least shelter. Instead, it seemed like just another one of the Overlord's cruel games. But Zarek wasn't finished. His claws danced over the console, his expression shifting from frustration to determination. "There's something here," he muttered. Maria leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the screen. "What do you mean?" Zarek pointed to a symbol that looked like a spiral. "Data. Hidden. The Overlord's secrets. If we can access it, we might find a way to fight back." Maria's breath caught. "You're sure?" "No," Zarek admitted, "but we have no other options." He tapped another symbol, and the console emitted a low, grinding sound. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passageway lined with glowing blue crystals. Maria hesitated. "Are we just going to ignore the part where you said this place was a death trap?" Zarek gave her a grim smile. "Do you have a better idea?" She sighed. Point taken. The discovery. The passageway was cold, the air sharp and dry. The crystals emitted a faint hum, and their light cast eerie shadows on the walls. Maria stayed close to Zarek, her weapon at the ready. "What's the plan if we find this data?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Expose him," Zarek said without hesitation. "The Overlord controls through fear and lies. If we can show his weaknesses, others will rise up." Maria raised an eyebrow. "That's a big if." Zarek didn't respond. He didn't need to. Maria could see the determination in his eyes. For the first time, she realized just how much this fight meant to him. It wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption. They reached the end of the passageway, where a massive door loomed before them. Zarek ran his claws over the control panel, and the door creaked open, revealing a circular chamber filled with holographic displays. Maria's jaw dropped. "What is this?" Zarek stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. The Overlord's archive. The key revelation. The holograms flickered to life as Zarek approached, filling the chamber with streams of alien text and images. Maria scanned the displays, trying to make sense of the symbols. Zarek stopped in front of one projection, his expression darkening. "This is it," he said, his voice low. Maria joined him, her eyes widening as she took in the image. It was a schematic of a massive ship, the Overlord's flagship. Beside it was a series of highlighted points, each marked with an alien symbol. "What are those?" she asked. Zarek's claws hovered over the symbols. "Weak points. Vulnerabilities." Maria's heart raced. "You mean we can actually destroy it?" Zarek nodded. "If we act quickly. He will know we've accessed this soon. We need to move." Before Maria could respond, the chamber shuddered. The holograms flickered, and a deep, menacing voice echoed through the room. "Well done, Zarek," the Overlord said, his tone laced with mockery. "I knew you would come here, but did you really think I would let you leave alive?" Maria's stomach dropped. "Zarek, tell me you've got a plan." He turned to her, his eyes blazing. "We fight," he said, "and we don't stop until he falls." Showdown with the Overlord. The flagship loomed above the jungle, its jagged silhouette slicing through the thick clouds like the blade of a guillotine. It wasn't just a ship, it was a fortress, an ominous reminder of the Overlord's power. The faint hum of its engines filled the air, vibrating through the ground like the pulse of a dying world. Maria crouched in the shadows of a crumbling outpost, her eyes fixed on the ship's docking bay. Zarek knelt beside her, his claws gripping the hilt of his blade. "This is suicide," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant roar of patrol ships circling overhead. "Perhaps," Zarek said, his gaze never wavering, "but it's the only way." Maria tightened her grip on the alien rifle she had scavenged. She wasn't ready for this. Not really. But there was no turning back now. The data they'd stolen had revealed a critical weakness in the flagship's core, a flaw that could destroy the Overlord and his reign of terror once and for all. The catch: they had to get aboard the ship to exploit it. "How do we even get past the guards?" Maria asked, scanning the entrance. Zarek's lips curled into a faint smile. "We make them chase us." Before Maria could protest, Zarek stepped out of cover and hurled a rock at the nearest patrol drone. The metallic clang echoed through the clearing, and the drone's red scanner snapped toward him. "You've got to be kidding me," Maria muttered, scrambling after him as the drone emitted a piercing alarm. The infiltration. The jungle erupted into chaos as more drones converged on their location, their scanners sweeping the area in search of the intruders. Zarek moved like a shadow, weaving through the underbrush with Maria close behind. "They're falling for it," Zarek said, glancing over his shoulder. "Great," Maria replied breathlessly. "Now what?" Zarek pointed to a maintenance shaft near the edge of the docking bay. "That." Maria's stomach twisted. The shaft was barely wide enough to crawl through, and it was guarded by 2 soldiers in insectoid armor. "Please tell me you have a plan," Maria said. Zarek didn't answer. Instead, he lunged forward, a blur of motion as he took out the first guard with a precise slash of his blade. The second guard raised his weapon, but Maria was already moving. She swung the rifle like a club, striking the soldier's helmet with enough force to send him sprawling. The path was clear, but the alarm had drawn more attention. Maria could hear the heavy footfalls of reinforcements approaching. "Go," Zarek barked, shoving her toward the shaft. Maria didn't hesitate. She crawled into the narrow tunnel, her heart racing as Zarek followed close behind. Inside the beast, the shaft was dark and claustrophobic, the metallic walls slick with condensation. Maria tried not to think about how far they had to crawl or what might be waiting for them on the other side. After what felt like an eternity, they reached an opening. Zarek peeked out first, his eyes scanning the corridor beyond. "Clear," he said, helping Maria out of the shaft. The corridor was dimly lit, the walls lined with glowing conduits that pulsed with an eerie blue light. The hum of the ship's engines was louder here, a constant reminder of the danger surrounding them. "This way," Zarek said, leading her toward the core. As they moved deeper into the ship, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air felt heavy, charged with an invisible tension. "Do you think he knows we're here?" she asked. Zarek didn't look at her. "He always knows." The confrontation. They reached the core chamber, a vast, circular room filled with towering pillars of energy. At the center was the ship's power source, a pulsating sphere of light encased in a network of cables and conduits. Maria stared at it, awe and fear warring within her. "That's it." Zarek nodded. "Destroy it, and the ship falls." Before they could move, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the chamber. "Zarek," the Overlord said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You have come so far, only to fail." Maria spun around, her heart pounding. The Overlord stepped out of the shadows, his massive form radiating power and menace. His armor gleamed like obsidian, and his glowing eyes seemed to pierce through them. Zarek stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the dim light. "I will not run from you anymore." The Overlord chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Then die like the coward you are." The chamber erupted into chaos as Zarek charged, his blade clashing against the Overlord's armor with a shower of sparks. Maria scrambled toward the core, her mind racing. She reached the control panel and began typing frantically, her fingers flying over the alien interface. "Zarek, I need time," she shouted. Zarek didn't respond, too focused on the brutal fight. The Overlord moved with terrifying precision, his every strike forcing Zarek to retreat. "Hurry," Zarek growled, blocking another blow. Maria's hands shook as she worked. The system was complex, but she was making progress. Finally, a flashing symbol appeared on the screen. "I got it," she yelled. The core began to destabilize, the sphere of light pulsing erratically. Alarms blared, and the ship shuddered violently. Zarek landed a final blow, forcing the Overlord back. "Go," he shouted, grabbing Maria and pulling her toward the exit. A new hope. The flagship was falling. Through the shattered viewport of an escape pod, Maria watched as the colossal vessel tore itself apart. Explosions rippled across its surface, sending debris tumbling into the atmosphere below. The once mighty symbol of the Overlord's dominance was now a dying star, its light fading as it plummeted toward the jungle-covered planet. Beside her, Zarek sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the destruction. His gray skin was streaked with blood, his own and the Overlord's, and his hands trembled as he gripped the pod's control panel. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their survival pressing down on them like a heavy shroud. "It's over," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. Zarek didn't respond. Maria glanced at him, her chest tightening. He looked lost, as if the victory they had fought so hard for had cost him something he couldn't get back. "Zarek," she said gently, "you did it. He's gone." Finally, he turned to her, his golden eyes wary. "Is he?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Or has his shadow simply moved to another place?" Maria didn't have an answer. The crash landing. The pod shuddered violently as it entered the planet's atmosphere, flames licking at its hull. Maria braced herself, gripping the sides of her seat as the pod spun out of control. Zarek, ever composed, adjusted the controls with steady hands, guiding them toward a clearing in the dense jungle. When they hit the ground, the impact was bone-jarring. The pod skidded to a halt, leaving a trail of scorched earth in its wake. Maria groaned, unbuckling herself from the harness. "You call that a landing?" she muttered, wincing as she stood. Zarek managed a faint smile. "We are alive, are we not?" She rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress her own small smile. Barely. The two of them stepped out of the pod, the humid air of the jungle washing over them. The clearing was quiet, save for the distant roar of the flagship's final explosion. A massive fireball lit up the sky, its light casting long shadows across the ground. For a moment, Maria and Zarek just stood there, watching the Overlord's legacy burn. The weight of freedom. Zarek knelt beside a fallen tree, his claws tracing the grooves in the bark. Maria approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. "You all right?" she asked. Zarek didn't look up. "For years, I dreamed of his death," he said quietly, "of breaking free. But now that it is done, I feel nothing." Maria crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That's not nothing," she said. "It's the weight lifting off your chest. You're free now, Zarek, really free." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And what do I do with this freedom? I was a slave for so long, I don't know how to be anything else." Maria hesitated, then gave him a small smile. "You start by deciding what kind of person you want to be. The Overlord's gone, Zarek. That means you get to choose your own future. Zarek's gaze softened, and for the first time, he looked at Maria with something that resembled hope. A new mission. As the jungle began to settle, Maria and Zarek started gathering supplies from the wreckage of the pod. They worked in silence, the weight of their journey still hanging over them. Maria broke the silence first. "You know, the galaxy's not exactly short on tyrants like him," she said, glancing at Zarek. "Could use someone like you out there." Zarek raised an eyebrow. "Like me?" "Yeah," Maria said with a smirk. "You're pretty good at this whole fighting evil thing. And I could use a co-pilot." Zarek tilted his head, considering her words. "You would trust me?" Maria shrugged. "You saved my life more times than I can count. I'd say you've earned it." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Zarek's lips. "Perhaps," he said. "But first, we must find a way off this planet." Maria grinned. "Well, lucky for us, I'm a pretty good mechanic." A signal of things to come. As they worked, a faint beeping sound caught Maria's attention. She followed it to a charred communications panel in the pod's wreckage. The screen flickered weakly, displaying a single line of alien text. "What is it?" Zarek asked, joining her. Maria frowned, her fingers flying over the controls. "It's a distress signal," she said slowly. "From where?" Maria's stomach sank as the coordinates appeared on the screen. It was another planet, deep in uncharted space. Zarek leaned closer, his expression darkening. "It's him, isn't it?" Maria nodded, or what's left of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Zarek straightened, his golden eyes blazing with determination. "Then we go," he said. Maria hesitated, then smiled. "You really are bad at taking breaks, aren't you?" He gave her a rare smirk. "Freedom is not rest. It is purpose." Together, they began preparing for the next chapter of their journey, their paths now forever entwined.